Welcome, dear listeners, to Murder Beneath the Summer Roses, a Miss Marple mystery. It is a gentle summer evening in the quaint village of Rose Hill, where sunlight melts behind neatly trimmed hedges and roses nod softly in the warm breeze. The cobbled lanes hum with the polite chatter of villagers strolling home, teacups clinking in gardens as church bells toll lazily in the distance. In her quiet cottage garden, Miss Marple sips her tea, eyes flicking to roses that bloom perhaps a touch too perfectly. But beneath this serene calm, a subtle unease lingers. If a hidden danger stirred here, how would you notice it? The village fete at Rosehill Manor was a vision of summer cheer. Stalls brimmed with jars of strawberry jam glistening in the sunlight, hand-sewn hats perched jauntily on heads, and the warm scent of freshly baked scones mingled with the perfume of roses in full bloom. Children darted around the marble fountain, their laughter rippling through the manicured gardens, while ladies in crisp summer dresses lingered beneath delicate parasols, exchanging whispered gossip and polite laughter. The air shimmered with the light-heartedness of a village at ease with itself. Then came the scream. Piercing, sudden, it cut through the cheerful murmur like a shard of glass. Villagers rushed toward the rose trellis at the far edge of the gardens, where Lady Haversham lay motionless, an unnatural angle to her fall suggesting more than a simple accident. A hush swept over the crowd, replaced by murmurs of suspicion. An unfortunate slip? Or something far more sinister? Miss Marple, standing a little apart with her keen eyes, quietly observing, noticed details others overlooked. A parasol toppled at an odd angle, a faint smudge of soil upon the gloves Lady Haversham had worn so carefully. Something about the scene whispered of hidden intentions. Would you, dear listener, trust the first explanation, or look closer? Chapter 1. Whispers Among the Roses. The afternoon sun had mellowed into a gentle warmth as the villagers of Rosehill drifted toward the tea room, their faces carrying that peculiar mixture of curiosity and concern that accompanies any disturbance in a place usually so tranquil. The quaint little establishment, with its lace curtains and polished wooden tables, seemed suddenly smaller, the clinking of teacups amplified, as if the very walls were straining to listen. Inside, the chatter was low but insistent, the words threading together a tapestry of speculation that was at once lively and unsettling. "Did you hear about Lady Haversham?" whispered Mrs. Penrose, her eyes wide behind delicate spectacles, fingers nervously adjusting her gloves. "I heard she fell near the rose trellis, but there are oddities." "Oh, it must have been the heat," interjected young Miss Linton, trying to smooth over the tension. "Perhaps she fainted while tending to her flowers. You know how frail she's been lately." "Frail, perhaps, but accidents do not always explain everything," murmured Mr. Faraday, a local grocer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial pitch. "I've seen quarrels between Lady Haversham and her neighbors. And what of the will? There's talk of new changes." Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively at a corner table, sipped her tea with quiet deliberation. She had no need to raise her voice. The fragments of conversation floated toward her naturally, as if guided by some invisible hand. It was not merely the words that intrigued her. It was the manner in which they were spoken, the flicker of an eye, the way Mrs. Penrose's hands trembled ever so slightly when she mentioned the will, the way Mr. Faraday's voice had a faint edge, a hesitation betraying knowledge he dared not share openly. She noticed Mrs. Linton's habit of smoothing her skirt, a tiny ritual that suggested nervousness rather than politeness, and the subtle tension in Mr. Faraday's jaw, as though he were holding back an observation too delicate, or too dangerous, to voice aloud. Every sigh, glance, and pause became a piece of a puzzle, an intricate web of human behavior that, when carefully observed, often revealed more than mere words could convey. Outside, the warm hum of the village continued, yet inside the tea room, the atmosphere had shifted. What had been a casual place for tea and polite conversation had transformed into a theater of suspicion and whispered fear. Villagers leaned closer to one another, their voices lowering further, sharing hints of gossip that, unchecked, threatened to twist into accusation. Miss Marple allowed a faint smile to touch her lips. Gossip, she knew, was a curious instrument, blunt in the hands of the unwary, yet incisive when carefully examined. Each fragment of rumor, each quiver in a voice, each awkward glance told her something subtle about the hearts and minds of Rose Hill's inhabitants. And from these threads, she would begin to weave the quiet understanding that might one day uncover the truth hidden beneath the summer roses. Would they, she wondered, realize that it was not the fall itself that mattered, but the small, human details that only the most attentive observer might perceive? The sun had begun its slow descent behind the hills surrounding Rose Hill, casting long shadows that stretched lazily across the cobbled lanes. Miss Marple walked home at a measured pace, her sensible shoes clicking softly against the stones, the evening air rich with the fragrance of roses that lined every garden she passed. Lanterns flickered to life along the lane, their warm glow lending a gentle intimacy to the village streets. Even the hum of distant chatter had softened, replaced by the quiet symphony of a summer evening. The whisper of leaves, the occasional chirp of a nightingale, the far-off toll of church bells marking the hour. Her mind, however, was far from tranquil. The afternoon's conversations at the tea room lingered persistently in her thoughts. Each voice she had heard, each hesitation, each subtle inflection seemed to replay in her mind, like threads she was attempting to weave into a coherent pattern. The missing pruning spade, mentioned almost casually by the gardener, seemed less incidental now. The chair that had been found slightly out of place in the rose garden nagged at her memory. Small details, overlooked by others in their rush to gossip and speculate, spoke volumes to Miss Marple's practiced eye. She recalled Mrs. Penrose's trembling hands as she mentioned the will, the curious deflection in Mr. Faraday's gaze, and even the faint smudge of dirt on Lady Haversham's gloves that she had noted from across the tea room. Each observation was a tiny piece of the puzzle, yet the picture hinted it remained frustratingly incomplete. The village, so serene and orderly under the golden evening light, was in fact a web of half-hidden motives and quiet resentments. Miss Marple's steps slowed as she passed the corner where the rose trellis of Lady Haversham's garden could just be glimpsed from the lane. The blooms, so vivid and perfect in the fading light, seemed almost to mock the tragedy that had unfolded there. How easily appearances could deceive, she thought, how the beauty of the summer roses could conceal the bitter undercurrents of jealousy, greed, and unspoken rivalries. By the time she reached her own cottage, tucked behind a neatly trimmed hedge and bathed in lantern light, she felt a subtle shift in her understanding. Nothing yet pointed directly to the cause of Lady Haversham's death, but the inconsistencies, the small irregularities, and the whispers of fear were beginning to form the outline of a hidden truth. In the quiet of her garden, with the scent of roses drifting through the evening air, Miss Marple settled in her chair, tea in hand, and allowed herself the first tentative smile. The village might seem as peaceful as ever, but she knew, as she always did, that beneath this tranquil surface, secrets stirred, secrets that would not remain buried for long. Chapter 2. Clues Hidden in Petals. The morning sun filtered softly through a pale haze, spilling golden light across Rose Hill Manor's gardens. Miss Marple stepped carefully along the gravel path leading to Lady Haversham's rose garden, her eyes sweeping the scene with quiet, methodical attention. The garden, usually a picture of cultivated perfection, now bore subtle disturbances that might have escaped the notice of less observant eyes. Petals still clung to their thorny stems, yet a few lay scattered unevenly, as though brushed aside in a hurried retreat. Miss Marple paused at the side gate, crouching to examine the soil. Here, faint footprints marred the otherwise pristine gravel, a pair of prints, muddied in haste, leading toward the outer hedge. She traced them with her gaze, noting the slight drag of the heel in one, as though the person had been cautious but not careful enough. Nearby, a hedge that typically held its sculpted symmetry showed a few branches bent oddly, suggesting someone had squeezed through or leaned too heavily. It was the kind of detail ordinary villagers might overlook entirely, but Miss Marple saw it as a silent testimony. Her gaze shifted, sharp and perceptive, to the rose bush nearest the trellis. There, caught on a thorn, was a small scrap of pale fabric, frayed at the edges. She plucked it gently and turned it over in her fingers. Nothing about it matched Lady Haversham's attire, and yet it was fine enough to belong to someone accustomed to handling delicate garments. A garter's apron, perhaps, or a visiting handmaid's sleeve. Miss Marple tucked it carefully into her pocket, her mind already cataloging the possibilities. Step by step, she wandered deeper into the rose beds, noting other small irregularities: a displaced watering can, a flower pot slightly ajar, and a ribbon trailing under a bench where it did not belong. Each was insignificant alone, but together they began to form a subtle map of the events that had unfolded. Miss Marple made mental notes: the footprints, the disturbed hedge, the scrap of fabric, the misaligned items. She had learned long ago that the smallest deviations often pointed most clearly to human intent. Birdsong and the distant hum of village life provided a soothing backdrop. Yet Miss Marple felt the quiet tension of observation pressing in. The garden's beauty contrasted sharply with the unease she sensed. Roses could conceal more than thorns, she reminded herself. Every twist of a petal, every shadow along the path, might hold a secret. With her eyes scanning and her mind compiling, she began to see a pattern forming. Not yet complete, but enough to guide her questions, her inquiries, and the careful, patient pursuit of truth. By the time she straightened and stepped back from the trellis, the garden had yielded a collection of subtle signs, each one a whisper of hidden actions. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves, pocketed her notes, and allowed herself a quiet thought. Appearances were always deceptive, and in the heart of the roses, the first threads of a deeper story had begun to unravel. Later that morning, Miss Marple wandered through the village lanes, exchanging polite greetings with those she met, all the while listening with the keen attention of someone accustomed to reading people rather than words alone. The baker, dusted with flour, muttered about Lady Haversham's sudden demise, his eyes flicking toward the rose garden with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Miss Marple inquired casually about the deceased's recent activities, letting her questions appear idle, as though the interest of a neighbor rather than an investigator guided her words. Mrs. Penrose, perched on the bench outside the post office, offered details she may not have shared otherwise. She had heard disagreements with several of the neighbors, she murmured, glancing at her own hands as though nervous they might betray her. Nothing severe, of course, but one must notice the undercurrents, mustn't one? Miss Marple nodded, her face neutral, her mind quietly filing away the information. As she moved along, Miss Marple's keen eyes caught subtle expressions and fleeting gestures: the tight clasp of a shopkeeper's hands, the averted gaze of a young maid, the careful emphasis in a widow's story. Each revealed a hint of tension, a suppressed emotion, or a private grievance. She did not press, did not accuse. Her questions were gentle, and in their politeness lay their power. Villagers felt they were merely talking to an observant friend, never realizing that each reply, each hesitation, was another clue to be catalogued. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple found herself back in the rose garden, drawn once more by that quiet instinct that had guided her since she first arrived. As she wandered near the trellis, her eyes fell upon a corner of paper tucked beneath a low-hanging rose bush, partially hidden by petals and thorny branches. Carefully, she bent to retrieve it, brushing away the soft greenery to reveal a folded letter, edges slightly worn. The handwriting was unfamiliar at first glance, deliberate and neat, yet a faint smudge betrayed hurried handling. Miss Marple's lips pressed together thoughtfully. Here, she realized, was something beyond gossip and conjecture, a tangible thread, left behind by someone who had wished for it to remain unnoticed. The letter might hold a motive, a secret, or a warning. Its mere presence under the roses was enough to pique her curiosity further. With the letter safely tucked into her pocket, Miss Marple straightened and allowed her gaze to drift over the garden once more. The sun had dipped slightly lower, casting longer shadows between the rose bushes, yet the ordinary charm of the garden concealed a quiet tension that seemed to hum in the air. The threads of conversation, the subtle observations of the morning, and now this mysterious letter began to weave together a pattern, one that only careful attention, patience, and understanding of human nature could reveal. She rose to her feet, brushing off her skirt, and whispered to herself in her gentle, thoughtful way. Appearances, she reminded herself, were rarely what they seemed. Beneath the beauty of the summer roses, secrets were already stirring. Chapter 3. The Gardener's Tale. By mid-morning, Rose Hill was buzzing with a different sort of energy, one far removed from the leisurely charm of summer afternoons. Whispers had begun to carry sharper edges, and eyes that once met politely now darted with suspicion. At the heart of the village's collective attention stood Mr. Cartwright, the gardener of Rose Hill Manor, a man whose quiet diligence had long gone unnoticed until circumstances now cast him in an unexpected light. It was said that only a week prior, Mr. Cartwright had argued with Lady Haversham over the pruning of her prized summer roses. The dispute, seemingly minor at the time, had been about the timing of her annual display, but in the village's fertile imagination, it became a potential motive, a quarrel that might have escalated into something far darker. Whispers at the bakery, the post office, and the tea room all hinted at a man capable of more than simple indignation. The police, efficient and pragmatic, arrived promptly. Chief Inspector Hargreaves, a solid man with a methodical mind, had quickly seized upon the first signs of tangible evidence. Muddy footprints near the side gate, matching the size of Mr. Cartwright's boots, appeared to place him at the scene. A pruning knife, which should have rested safely in the gardener's shed, was found missing, as if abandoned in haste. To those observing from the sidelines, the case seemed straightforward. Opportunity, motive, and physical evidence converged neatly on one man. Even villagers who knew Mr. Cartwright well felt a pang of doubt. Mrs. Penrose, despite her warm disposition, whispered over a cup of tea that she had always found his temper a little unpredictable. The young baker, who delivered daily bread to the manor, mentioned casually that he had overheard a raised voice between gardener and mistress just days before the tragedy. These recollections, minor in isolation, now took on weight under the growing shadow of suspicion. Yet in the midst of the murmurs and the pointed glances, Miss Marple observed quietly, almost imperceptibly. She noticed how Mr. Cartwright's expression remained calm, almost weary, rather than the flustered guilt one might expect from someone concealing a crime. His hands, though earthy from gardening, bore no signs of struggle, and his explanations, though simple, held a natural consistency. Villagers, absorbed in the apparent evidence, failed to see these subtleties. Outside, the summer sun cast sharp shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns, highlighting the edges of flower beds where small disturbances could be found. A fallen rose, a slightly ajar gate, but nothing that conclusively implicated Mr. Cartwright. The village chatter, once casual and friendly, had taken on a hushed urgency, each whisper feeding the sense of certainty that the gardener had acted in anger. Miss Marple, observing from the edge of the crowd, allowed her thoughts to drift. Evidence might point in one direction, she mused, but human behavior, often far less predictable, could conceal truth behind the most convincing facade. Even the most meticulous arrangement of footprints and tools could be misleading when intentions were hidden beneath ordinary appearances. The villagers saw only what they expected, but she, quietly attentive, had begun to notice the first threads that suggested the story might be far more intricate than it seemed. Miss Marple lingered near the edge of the manor garden, her eyes following Mr. Cartwright as he spoke softly to Chief Inspector Hargreaves. The gardener's posture was relaxed, almost resigned, yet there was a calmness in his movements that contrasted sharply with the gravity of the accusations. He wiped his hands on a cloth, gesturing naturally as he recounted the morning of Lady Haversham's fall, his story punctuated by quiet pauses rather than defensive sharpness. To anyone else, this might have seemed the behavior of a guilty man, but Miss Marple, with decades of observing human nature, sensed something far subtler. Her attention returned to the supposed evidence. The muddy footprints, the missing pruning knife, both seemed compelling to those untrained in human observation. Yet Miss Marple noted irregularities. The footprints were slightly too erratic for someone in a hurry to commit a crime. They suggested hesitation, a mind preoccupied with other thoughts. The knife's absence, she reflected, could just as easily indicate carelessness in storage rather than malicious intent. And then there was the hedge, bent as if someone had brushed past in haste, yet none of the disturbances aligned convincingly with Mr. Cartwright's known routine. As she circled the scene, her gaze fell upon a small, wooden trowel lying beside a neatly trimmed rosebed. It was ordinary enough to escape notice, yet its placement struck her as odd. Not far from the footprints and the trellis, it seemed almost deliberately positioned, as if meant to draw attention, yet incongruous with the gardener's usual methodical order. Miss Marple bent to examine it, her gloved hand brushing away a stray petal. A quiet thought settled in her mind. This small tool could very well be a planted clue, a subtle misdirection intended to mislead both villagers and investigators. She studied Mr. Cartwright once more. The man's calm demeanor, the natural flow of his movements, and the absence of any signs of panic or guilt all reinforced her growing conviction. He was being framed. Someone had anticipated the village's eagerness to assign blame. Someone clever enough to exploit human assumptions and the simplicity of appearances. The true culprit, she realized, was still at large, moving silently among the unsuspecting villagers, hidden behind the everyday charm of summer roses and sunlit lanes. Miss Marple stood quietly, allowing the breeze to stir the petals around her feet, the gentle fragrance mingling with the unease she had begun to sense in the village. She tucked the trowel into her mental catalog of anomalies, alongside the footprints, the hedge, and the missing knife, knowing that each would form part of the tapestry of evidence she would need to unravel. With a soft sigh, She straightened and let her gaze drift across the garden once more, confident that patience and careful observation would, in time, reveal the truth concealed beneath Rosehill's summer blossoms. The first threads of deception were now visible, but the full pattern had yet to emerge. Chapter 4: Secrets Beneath the Petals. Miss Marple had long understood that the most ordinary facades often concealed the sharpest edges of human emotion, and the quiet rooms of Rosehill Manor now offered proof of this truth. She had been permitted, through the gentle insistence of the housekeeper, to sort through Lady Haversham's personal effects, ostensibly to gather belongings for relatives. Yet the exercise revealed far more than mere possessions. It unveiled the intricate, sometimes tangled web of relationships that had surrounded the lady in life. In a modest drawer beneath the desk, she found a stack of diaries, each bound in faded leather and filled with the meticulous script of a woman both precise and passionate. Miss Marple leafed through them carefully, noting entries that spoke of neighborly disputes thinly veiled beneath polite phrasing. One passage described a disagreement over the ownership of a rare rose cultivar, a heated exchange with Mrs. Fairchild, a neighbor who had long envied Lady Haversham's horticultural skill. The entry, casual in tone, nonetheless hinted at deeper resentments, a simmering tension that might have seemed inconsequential to the casual reader. Beneath the diaries lay a collection of letters, folded and addressed in elegant handwriting. Some were from family, others from friends, but one in particular drew her attention, a letter written by a man whose signature she did not recognize. Its content was delicate yet intimate, speaking of meetings in quiet corners of the manor gardens, late evening strolls past the fountain, and whispered confidences beneath the rose trellis. A secret romance, it seemed, one that had been carefully concealed from even the closest neighbors. Miss Marple noted how such passions, when hidden from polite society, could intensify the stakes of any dispute, creating motives that were invisible on the surface. Finally, she found references to the upcoming Garden Fete Awards, a subject Lady Haversham had treated with unexpected gravity. Entries described strategies for ensuring her prize roses would outshine the competition, alongside subtle barbs regarding rival gardeners and anxious musings over who might claim what recognition. To any visitor, the village appeared serene, its residents courteous and composed, yet beneath this exterior thrived ambition, envy, and secret grievances. Miss Marple recognized, as she had so many times before, that in such a setting the smallest slights could fester into motives both passionate and dangerous. She closed the diaries gently, placing the letters in her satchel. Each document was a key, each revelation a thread that, when woven together with the observations she had already made, began to sketch the outlines of a far more complex narrative than the villagers suspected. Where gossip suggested simple anger, the written words revealed strategy, desire, and rivalry. The village of Rosehill, so charming in the summer sunlight, was anything but simple. Beneath its neatly trimmed hedges and blushing roses lay passions that could, and evidently had, turned deadly. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, the faint scent of old paper mingling with the lingering aroma of roses from the garden outside. She allowed herself a quiet, reflective thought. Appearances, after all, are often the most reliable disguise of all. Miss Marple spent the afternoon visiting familiar corners of Rosehill, her inquiries gentle yet deliberate. She spoke with longtime friends of Lady Haversham, old acquaintances who had shared tea and conversation with the lady for decades, and with servants whose loyalty had spanned years. Each encounter, conducted with her characteristic courtesy, peeled back another layer of the village's charming exterior, revealing undercurrents of resentment, envy, and quietly nurtured grudges. One former companion, Mrs. Ellsworth, recounted with a sigh how Lady Haversham had long felt overshadowed by a distant cousin who frequently visited under the guise of friendship. She was polite, yes, Mrs. Ellsworth murmured, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. But her words could sting, and not all in the village would forget. In another corner of the village, a housemaid revealed that the late lady had recently clashed with a young neighbor over seating arrangements at garden parties, a matter trivial in itself, yet revealing a pattern of pride, competitiveness, and subtle control. Even the long-serving cook contributed, quietly mentioning a forgotten incident years earlier. A disagreement over a favorite dessert recipe had once escalated to weeks of cold civility between two households, an episode Miss Marple noted with a small, knowing smile. It was a reminder that the seemingly polite manners of Rosehill concealed not just past squabbles, but also a store of feelings powerful enough to fester beneath the sunlit gardens and cobbled streets. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple wandered again through the rose garden of Rosehill Manor, her mind piecing together the fragments she had gathered. Then, near the far edge of the garden, her attention was caught by something unusual. A second rose bush, planted a little apart from the others, its branches trimmed in a manner more precise, almost deliberate than the rest. The careful pruning stood out, subtle yet deliberate, as if someone had taken great care to create a specific effect. She crouched and studied it, noting the neatness of each cut and the slight indentation in the soil, suggesting it had been tended with a purpose beyond ordinary gardening. A thought formed quietly in her mind. This was no ordinary mistake, no simple accident of carelessness. Someone had acted with forethought, anticipating the garden's beauty as a stage for something hidden beneath its surface. The bush, so perfectly sculpted, seemed to hint at premeditation, a silent, almost imperceptible signature left for those with eyes to see. Rising slowly, Miss Marple allowed the warmth of the summer sun to fall across her shoulders as she considered the implications. Rosehill, with all its serene charm and polite civility, was layered now with tension, secrecy, and a careful cunning she had not noticed before. And in that quiet observation of an otherwise unassuming rose bush, she realized that the threads of the mystery were beginning to intertwine, forming a pattern that only patience, subtlety, and the keen observation of human nature could ever hope to unravel. Chapter 5. The Withering Twist. The night had settled over Rosehill like a velvet cloak, soft and quiet, yet beneath its stillness, unease simmered. Lanterns flickered along the cobbled lanes, casting long, wavering shadows across the rose-laden gardens. The village, usually serene at this hour, seemed to hold its breath, as though anticipating some unseen movement. It was during this delicate hush that the sharp clatter of a body hitting stone shattered the calm, drawing villagers and constables alike to the scene. Mr. Thompson, a retired schoolmaster known for his punctual evening strolls, lay sprawled near the central rose trellis. Panic rippled through the gathered crowd. Some whispered about an unfortunate slip, others speculated about fainting spells, yet the collective murmur carried a rising tension, a fear that something far more deliberate might be at play. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness, illuminating his shaken expression and the scattering of rose petals around him. Miss Marple arrived quietly, her steps measured, yet every eye seemed to seek her out for reassurance. She observed the scene calmly, noting details others overlooked. The angle at which Mr. Thompson had fallen, the absence of obstruction along the path, and the faint scuff marks in the gravel that did not align with a simple stumble. Nothing about the scene suggested carelessness. Instead, there was a subtle rhythm to the disorder, a pattern that whispered of intention. As villagers clustered around, fear sharpened their voices, and their hands gestured in frantic speculation. "It's a curse on the garden," cried one neighbor, half joking, half frightened. "2 accidents in a week? How could it be mere coincidence?" Miss Marple shook her head softly, her keen eyes scanning the garden once more. She noticed a subtle alignment between the locations of Lady Haversham's fall and Mr. Thompson's injury, the space between the rose trellis and the side gate forming an almost deliberate path. The injured schoolmaster, though shaken, reassured the constables that he had not felt the ground shift beneath him. Miss Marple's mind, ever alert to human nature and subtle signals, noted his measured speech, the absence of panic in his tone, and the careful placement of his hands, gestures that hinted at truth rather than embellishment. She knelt briefly, examining the gravel and nearby roses, comparing them silently with the earlier scene. There, amid the soft glow of lantern light, she began to perceive what others could not. These events were connected, a deliberate series rather than a string of misfortunes. A quiet hush fell over the garden as Miss Marple rose, her gaze sweeping the lantern-lit paths, the manicured hedges, and the roses in bloom. She sensed, with the clarity that only comes from long experience, that the village was no longer merely a stage for gossip and rivalry. The stakes had risen, the danger tangible, and a deliberate hand was moving among them, unseen yet precise. Panic might cloud the villagers' minds, but she knew that patience, observation, and understanding of human nature would reveal the pattern beneath the chaos, a pattern carefully hidden beneath the beauty of the summer roses. In the quiet hours after the second incident, Miss Marple retreated to her cottage, her mind already weaving together the fragments of the day. She spread out her mental notes like petals on a table, reviewing each subtle clue she had observed. The footprints near the trellis, the oddly positioned garden tools, the slight smudge of dirt on gloves, and the whispered argument she had overheard in the tea room. Alone with her thoughts, she began to see patterns forming, the threads of human behavior and hidden intention intertwining in a way that others, distracted by fear and gossip, could not perceive. She recalled Mr. Cartwright's calm demeanor, the planted trowel, and the irregular pruning of the second rose bush, each oddity a deliberate distraction meant to mislead the eye. Then there were the scattered petals near Lady Haversham's fall, the footprints leading in unusual directions, and Mr. Thompson's unusual stumble, each echoing the same careful orchestration. It was no longer random misfortune. Someone had considered every detail, manipulating the garden, the villagers, and even the evidence itself. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to conversations she had overheard, softly spoken grievances, subtle rivalries, and private tensions that had once seemed minor but now shimmered with significance. A casual mention of a missing envelope, passed off as an insignificant oversight, returned to her mind. She recalled seeing it half concealed beneath a rose bush, as though left deliberately for discovery by someone aware of human curiosity. That small envelope, so easily overlooked, was like a fingerprint in the garden's design, suggesting the careful mind of a perpetrator who delighted in control and misdirection. Cross-referencing these details, she began to sketch a web of potential motives. The financial disputes, secret romances, envy over awards, and past grievances formed a network of opportunity and resentment. Each villager had connections to Lady Haversham and, unknowingly, to the unfolding incidents. Yet despite the clarity of motive in many cases, the identity of the person orchestrating the chaos remained frustratingly elusive. Whoever was behind it moved with intelligence, anticipating every reaction, planting clues to mislead those who watched too eagerly. Miss Marple rose and walked slowly to her window, gazing across the lantern-lit garden that now felt both familiar and subtly threatening. The roses shimmered in the evening breeze, beautiful yet concealing more than any casual observer would imagine. Somewhere amid the blooms and pathways lay the deliberate hand behind the accidents, the misdirection, and the carefully arranged evidence. And in the quiet attention to detail, the misplaced envelope, the trowel, the pattern of footprints, Miss Marple felt the first glimmer of understanding. The puzzle was beginning to take shape. Only patience, observation, and careful deduction would reveal the mind clever enough to orchestrate the chaos beneath Rosehill's summer roses. Chapter 6. The Garden Trap. Miss Marple had long understood that the most effective way to uncover hidden truths was not through confrontation, but through gentle observation. With this principle in mind, she devised a plan subtle enough to avoid arousing suspicion, yet precise enough to reveal the behaviors and motives that had remained concealed until now. She announced a small gathering in her own garden, a rose pruning demonstration, under the pretense of sharing horticultural knowledge with interested villagers. Invitations were discreetly extended to those whose involvement, whether by motive, opportunity, or curiosity, warranted closer attention. On the appointed afternoon, the garden glowed under a warm summer sun, roses heavy with blooms, their scent mingling with the soft murmur of birds. Villagers arrived in light chatter, polite smiles, and casual curiosity. Miss Marple greeted each guest with her customary warmth, never revealing the true purpose of the gathering. As she demonstrated the delicate art of trimming a spent blossom or shaping a branch, she observed with keen, unassuming eyes. Reactions varied subtly but tellingly. Mr. Faraday, the grocer, lingered too long near the trellis, glancing frequently toward a section of the garden where the soil had been recently disturbed. Mrs. Penrose offered a helpful comment, yet her tone carried a faint edge of defensiveness when Miss Marple praised Lady Haversham's earlier arrangements. Even Mr. Cartwright, invited to share his expertise in a seemingly innocuous role, exhibited subtle signs of tension, an unusual stiffness in posture, a hand brushing against a trowel he did not need. Miss Marple took mental notes with gentle precision. The beauty of the demonstration served as a perfect cover. Villagers spoke freely, moved naturally, and revealed themselves in their habits, gestures, and casual remarks. She noted who lingered near the second rose bush, whose eyes flicked toward the trellis, and whose hands trembled ever so slightly when discussing pruning techniques. Each micro-reaction, each deviation from ordinary composure, added a thread to the web of understanding she was quietly weaving. No questions were pointed, no accusations made, yet the psychological trap was working. The familiar atmosphere of a garden, the gentle focus on roses and technique, provided a safe stage on which the true natures of her visitors could appear unguarded. Miss Marple, seated among the rose beds with her notebook subtly open, allowed herself a faint smile. By the time the demonstration concluded, she had observed enough to identify patterns invisible to anyone less practiced, a collection of subtle inconsistencies, nervous gestures, and small but meaningful actions that hinted strongly at the mind behind the chaos. As the villagers departed, thanking her politely and praising the blossoms, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the second rose bush, pruned with deliberate precision. The garden itself had become a silent witness to intent, and she felt confident that the web of evidence she had patiently assembled was ready to guide the next stage. Quiet observation, she knew, was often more revealing than interrogation. Here, In the sunlit roses and polite conversation, the trap had already begun to work, and the truth was poised to emerge. As the rose pruning demonstration unfolded, Miss Marple's eyes roamed calmly over the assembled villagers, noting each movement and expression with the quiet patience that had served her so well over the years. The afternoon sun cast dappled light across the garden, illuminating the delicate petals and the small, purposeful motions of hands working with scissors and shears. To the casual observer, it was a scene of serenity and simple instruction. But Miss Marple observed beneath the surface, attuned to subtle deviations from ordinary behavior. It was Mr. Faraday who first betrayed himself, though in the most unassuming manner. As Miss Marple spoke of the importance of careful pruning near the trellis, his eyes flicked briefly toward the recently disturbed patch of soil, and a muscle in his jaw twitched ever so slightly. To anyone else, it would have been dismissed as a natural response to conversation. To Miss Marple, it spoke volumes. She noted the hesitation in his movements as he stepped closer to demonstrate, as if ensuring he did not disturb anything inadvertently. But why such careful attention to an area of the garden that held no immediate interest for a simple demonstration? Meanwhile, Mrs. Penrose, ostensibly attentive to Miss Marple's instructions, kept her hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles whitened and her lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes, flitting repeatedly toward the trellis and the second rose bush, suggested a consciousness more aware than her polite exterior would allow. Miss Marple made a mental note. Both villagers were exhibiting signs of nervousness and internal conflict, but only one would align with the evidence she had quietly gathered over the past week. A sudden distraction, a loose rose branch brushing against Mr. Faraday's arm, caused him to step back, faltering for a brief moment. His hand shook as he adjusted a nearby lantern, almost revealing the slight dirt smudge he had not yet noticed Miss Marple had observed earlier. That micro-movement, a flicker of anxiety, confirmed the suspicion she had been cultivating. This was no mere bystander, no coincidental presence in the garden of misfortune. The pattern of footprints, the misplaced tools, the subtle pruning of the secondary rose bush, all pointed toward him. Miss Marple, maintaining her gentle demeanor, allowed the demonstration to continue as though nothing had occurred. Yet inside, she felt the thrill of nearing a conclusion. The murderer had almost hidden their hand once more, nearly escaping detection by blending into the polite routines of Rose Hill life. And yet, in that small hesitation, that nervous glance, and the barely perceptible twitch, the truth shimmered faintly in the summer light. The careful web she had constructed, the observations, conversations, and minor anomalies, was finally aligning, drawing the elusive culprit ever closer to exposure and leaving the garden itself poised on the edge of revelation. Chapter 7. Beneath the Summer Roses. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow over the Rose Hill Manor gardens, illuminating the carefully tended roses and the neatly swept paths. Miss Marple had invited the key villagers to gather beneath the sprawling trellis, the air thick with anticipation, yet tinged with the gentle fragrance of summer blooms. Each guest arrived with polite curiosity, unaware that the quiet charm of the garden would soon transform into a stage for revelation. Miss Marple seated herself on a low garden bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She spoke in her customary soft, deliberate tone, allowing her words to draw attention without seeming to command it. "We have all observed the beauty of these roses," she began. Yet, as is often the case, appearances may conceal a more complicated truth. She paused, letting the sentence settle over the listeners, eyes flicking subtly toward each face as though inviting recognition of her meaning. Slowly, she began to recount the sequence of events, weaving together observations that, to the villagers, had seemed disconnected. Footprints near the side gate, the bent hedge, and the scrap of fabric caught on a thorn. Each small detail she described in turn, with gentle clarity, yet with an authority that demanded attention. She emphasized the anomalies that had initially been dismissed. The misplaced trowel, the unusually pruned second rose bush, and the small envelope partially hidden beneath the petals. As Miss Marple spoke, the villagers listened intently, their polite expressions giving way to quiet realization. She guided them through the interactions, overheard arguments, and subtle tensions that had seemed harmless when viewed in isolation. The letters and diaries, she explained, revealed rivalries and resentments, but it was the combination of these private grievances with the evidence found in the garden that illuminated a pattern, one that could not be attributed to mere chance. Her narrative was precise, methodical, and yet gentle, allowing each person to perceive the connections without feeling accused. She described the second incident, Mr. Thompson's fall, and how the placement of footprints and minor disturbances had mirrored those at Lady Haversham's trellis. Each piece fell into place, forming a web of cause and effect, opportunity and intent, all observed and cataloged by a mind attuned to human nature. By the time she concluded this portion of her explanation, the garden was suffused not only with the scent of roses, but with a hushed tension. Villagers exchanged glances, realizing the subtle orchestration of events had gone far beyond their initial assumptions. Miss Marple's words had illuminated the deliberate care with which the incidents had been staged, guiding the assembly toward the inevitable recognition. The truth lay hidden beneath the petals and pathways they had taken for granted, and the puzzle, once fragmentary, now emerged with startling clarity. Miss Marple paused, letting the quiet murmur of the garden settle, her gaze sweeping over the villagers as if inviting them to look more closely at one another. "The events that have so troubled Rosehill," she began, her voice calm but firm, "were not accidents. They were the result of careful planning, born of jealousy, ambition, and greed." A hush fell over the assembled crowd, each person sensing that the long, subtle tension woven through their village was about to be exposed. She pointed gently toward Mr. Faraday, who stood stiffly near the trellis, cheeks flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and apprehension. The footprints, the displaced tools, the carefully pruned rose bush, and the hidden letters all bear witness to his intent. In his desire to influence the outcome of the garden fete, to protect his own interests, and to control the fortunes of Lady Haversham's estate, he orchestrated a sequence of events that, fortunately, were uncovered before further harm could occur. The words hung in the air, precise, yet delivered with the understated civility that had long defined Miss Marple's manner. The villagers gasped softly, some whispering in shock, others murmuring words of admiration for the detective insight that had quietly unraveled the mystery. Mr. Faraday's eyes shifted from one person to another, his composure faltering as he realized that the web of evidence, painstakingly collected by an observant mind, left no room for escape. Small errors, the nervous glance, the habitual twitch, the overlooked envelope, had betrayed him despite the meticulous care he had taken to maintain appearances. Miss Marple continued, her tone unwavering yet gentle. "It is remarkable how often human habits, those little routines we take for granted, become the threads by which the truth can be traced. Even the most careful planning cannot erase the subtle signatures left behind by instinct, fear, or pride." She gestured toward the garden itself, where sunlight lingered on the petals, casting delicate shadows that mirrored the careful but imperfect concealment of intent. As the villagers absorbed the revelation, relief slowly spread through the crowd. Whispers of admiration mingled with a newfound sense of security. The knowledge that justice had been quietly restored, settling over the manor grounds like a soft evening breeze. Mr. Faraday, subdued and aware of his exposure, was gently led away by the constables, while the remaining villagers exchanged glances of acknowledgment and gratitude toward Miss Marple. Finally, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, reflective smile. The roses, once silent witnesses to misdeeds and tension, now seemed to bask in the sense of calm that followed truth. The village's charm, though slightly marred by recent events, was restored, not through punishment alone, but through understanding, observation, and the subtle unraveling of human nature. Beneath the summer roses, order and justice had quietly returned, leaving Rose Hill once again to its tranquil summer rhythms, the secrets and shadows now illuminated by reason, insight, and the gentle authority of Miss Marple's perception. Chapter 8. Summer's Gentle Aftermath. Morning in Rose Hill arrived with the familiar chiming of church bells, their steady rhythm marking the return of routine to a village that had, only days before, been unsettled by fear and suspicion. The sun rose over cobbled streets and neatly trimmed hedges, illuminating the roses that now seemed to bloom with renewed vibrancy, as though aware that their silent role in recent events had concluded. Villagers moved through their familiar patterns with measured steps, some pausing to exchange greetings, others lingering over morning tea, their conversations infused with reflection and newfound awareness. At the tea room, chairs were once again arranged with careful symmetry, cups clinking gently as tea was poured, and the aroma of fresh scones filled the air. Mrs. Penrose and the baker chatted quietly about the events of the previous week, their tones softened by understanding and a hint of awe at the resolution. The village, they realized, had been shaped by forces unseen, guided by motives that simmered beneath polite conversation and outward charm. Even the simplest interactions, handing over a plate of jam, exchanging a pleasantry on the street, carried layers of meaning that only attentive observation could fully reveal. Miss Marple, strolling slowly along the sun-dappled lanes, observed the returning rhythm of life with gentle satisfaction. She noted how villagers moved through their routines with a mixture of relief and thoughtful awareness, their awareness heightened by recent revelations. The local children, once wary of the garden paths where accidents had occurred, now played freely again, chasing one another past the fountain and under the trellises, laughter mingling with the scent of summer blooms. Even the birds seemed to sing with a renewed lightness, as though acknowledging the village's restored equilibrium. As she wandered past the manor, Miss Marple allowed herself to reflect on the delicate balance of human nature she had witnessed. Beneath the polite facades, passions and rivalries had simmered. Jealousy, ambition, and unspoken grievances had shaped events with subtle precision. Yet through patience, observation, and careful reasoning, the quiet truths had emerged, allowing the village to resume its leisurely pace without leaving shadowed uncertainty lingering in every corner. In the rose garden, a few villagers paused to admire the blooms, acknowledging with a polite smile the delicate work of both nature and human hands. Conversations were gentle, thoughtful, and often tinged with a quiet recognition of the layers that had always existed beneath Rose Hill's charming exterior. Miss Marple, walking slowly among the pathways, observed the harmonious rhythm of life restored, yet remained alert to the subtle signs of human behavior, knowing that beneath the prettiest petals, the human heart retains secrets both profound and enduring. The village, though forever touched by recent events, had reclaimed its sunlit, fragrant calm. Church bells, the soft clatter of teacups, and the murmured laughter of children intertwined once more, each note a reminder that even amidst disruption, order and serenity could quietly reassert themselves. Life in Rose Hill, gentle and unhurried, had returned to its accustomed flow. The late afternoon sun bathed Rose Hill in a honeyed glow as Miss Marple knelt among the rose beds, her hands gentle but precise as she pruned each bloom. The rhythmic snip of her scissors and the soft rustle of leaves provided a comforting cadence, one that echoed the quiet order of the village now restored. The garden, once the site of tension and tragedy, had become a sanctuary once more, fragrant with the rich scent of roses and the lingering warmth of summer air. As she worked, her thoughts drifted naturally to the lessons recent events had imparted. Human nature, she reflected, is a tapestry woven from both light and shadow, politeness masking envy, courtesy concealing ambition, and laughter sometimes disguising resentment. The villagers, with their careful routines and charming facades, had revealed their passions in subtle ways. A glance too long, a hand too tightly clenched, a hesitation in speech. It was in these small details, often overlooked, that truth could be found. Miss Marple's gaze moved from one carefully pruned bloom to another, each petal a reminder of the delicate interplay between appearances and reality. The second rose bush, once a clue to premeditated mischief, now seemed a symbol of the precision with which intentions could be hidden beneath beauty. Life in the village had resumed, yet it was subtly altered. Those who had been directly involved carried a quiet awareness of human frailty, and even the neighbors who had only observed now regarded familiar faces with a touch more scrutiny. She paused, brushing a stray petal from her sleeve, and considered the value of observation, patience, and empathy. Justice had been restored not through force, but through understanding, through careful attention to the nuances of behavior, the tiny inconsistencies that reveal what is otherwise concealed. And yet, as much as the mystery had been solved, she sensed that Rose Hill's calm was only surface deep. The patterns of human desire and secret ambition were never truly exhausted. Beneath the village's serene streets and sunlit gardens, the potential for new puzzles always lingered, quietly awaiting discovery. A faint breeze stirred the roses, scattering petals across the cobblestones, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a subtle movement near the edge of the garden, a shadow that seemed fleeting and unremarkable, yet oddly out of place. She smiled faintly, a gentle acknowledgment of the truth she had always known. Mystery never truly vanishes. Even in the sunniest of gardens and the quietest of villages, secrets lie hidden, waiting for the observant eye to notice, for the patient mind to untangle. As she rose from the garden bench and dusted her hands, Miss Marple allowed herself a soft sigh of contentment. Rose Hill felt whole again, bathed in summer light and scented with roses, yet the village had changed imperceptibly. And in that gentle shift, she knew that the world, with all its quiet deceptions and subtle truths, would continue to offer stories worth observing, stories that, like the roses themselves, bloomed quietly, waiting for the right moment to reveal their secrets. The sun dipped low over Rose Hill, casting long, golden shadows across the cobbled streets and fragrant rose gardens. Life had returned to its familiar rhythm. Church bells chimed over the village square, teacups clinked in the cozy tea room, and children's laughter danced through the lanes once more. Yet beneath the charming surface, the villagers carried a quiet awareness, an understanding that even the most serene facades could conceal passions, rivalries, and secrets waiting patiently to be discovered. Miss Marple, seated in her own garden, surveyed the scene with gentle satisfaction. Each rose she tended, each carefully pruned branch, reminded her of the delicate balance between appearances and truth, and how subtly human nature could shape events. With patience, observation, and quiet reasoning, she had unraveled the mysteries hidden beneath the summer blooms, restoring peace to the village while revealing the threads of ambition, jealousy, and curiosity that had driven them. As the evening breeze stirred the petals, she reflected that Rose Hill, with all its beauty and charm, was a village forever rich in stories. And though this chapter had drawn to a close, she knew that secrets and intrigue would continue to linger among its hedges and lanes, awaiting the keen eyes of those willing to notice the small, telling details. Dear listeners, now it is your turn to ponder. Which villager's secret surprised you the most, and how would you have solved it? Share your thoughts and predictions in the comments below, and join the gentle suspense of Miss Marple's world, where every garden, teacup, and whispered conversation may conceal a mystery just waiting to be uncovered. In Rose Hill, peace has returned, for now, but the allure of quiet observation and the subtle thrill of discovery remind us that cozy mysteries are never truly finished. They bloom patiently, much like the roses beneath which truth always waits.